gaining independence from the colonial rule. For sure, the past 6 decades have seen this continent experience over 100 military coups. Some statistics put it at 106, to be exact, military coups. Out of the 486 attempted coups, all successful military coups carried out globally. Since 1950, Africa accounts for the largest number, which stands at around 214, of which at least 106 have been successful. And at least 45 of the 54 nations across the African continent have experienced uh, a minimum of one coup since independence. So, as the continent, the discussions around democracy really mean so much. Since 1990, 78% of the 27 coups in sub-Saharan Africa have taken place in the former French colonies. Countries like Chad, Mali, Gabon, Guinea, Niger, Burkina Faso, among others, have all been on the list of those countries that have been having continuous military coups or military takeovers. The story of coups being predominant in Francophone Africa especially attributed to the complex legacy of what we've termed the fake independence that France has granted its former colonies, setting the stage for the political instability that we are seeing right now. Additionally, the proliferation of life presidencies resulting from the leaders tinkering with the national constitutions to remove term limits has further eroded the foundations of democracy. I think countries that come to anybody's mind, um, we can say there is Uganda, there is Chad, we have Gabon, we have Rwanda, we have Guinea, Equatorial Guinea, Ivory Coast, and Cameroon, among others. And all these, we've seen the incumbents manipulate the constitution to extend their stay in power. Today, the 15th of September, which is the International Day of Democracy, we reflect on the state of democracy, not just in the world, but specifically to the case of Africa and what does that mean. In this webinar series, we delve deep into the pressing issues of military coups, the manipulation of elections, but also the future of democracy on the continent. This webinar series is brought to you by Alliance for Finance Monitoring, ACFIM, which is a Pan-African civil society organization and think tank that defends democracy by promoting transparency in political financing, including elections. Also, we are joined by Athionet, which is the African Election Observers Network, which is the apex coordinating platform for election observers in Africa. And it's good to have all of you being part of this conversation. Just to ensure that you participate, you can join us. We are live on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook. And we are running this across the ACFIM Africa. So to weigh in on this conversation, I'm joined by a panel of democracy experts across Africa. And with me, let me start with Mr. Slim Bouzid from Tunisia. He is the current president of Murakbun, which is an association that defends democracy through election observation, deepening decentralization in Tunisia, and promoting political accountability. He has worked previously with Democracy Reporting International. He has also worked with the Euro-Mediterranean Foundation, supporting human rights defenders. He has also done a lot of work around monitoring and evaluation, having worked with UNDP to observe and monitor several international cooperation programs that focus on Africa. Mr. Slim Buzid, you are most welcome. Pleasure to have you.
Thank you for your welcoming word. Thank you for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be among you in this very important day for our continent. Thank you.
Pleasure is ours. Let me also take this opportunity to introduce Samson Itodo. Samson, if you don't mind, just put on your camera for anybody who is joining us to know the person I'm introducing. Samson is the current executive director at Yaga Africa, which is a frontline non-profit organization promoting participatory democracy, human rights, and civic participation. He is also a community organizer, he's a development practitioner, and an expert in elections, parliamentary strengthening, constitutional building, youth development, and community organizing. He is known for being part of the team that led the movement for the reduction of age limit for running for public office in Nigeria. Itodo has also invested heavily in building the next generation of leaders with requisite capacity, character, and competence to transform Africa. Samson, you're most welcome to this webinar series.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
With me also, I have Henry Muguzi from Uganda, who is a political scientist, social researcher, campaign finance expert, is the founding executive director of Alliance for Finance Monitoring, a Pan-African CSO that defends democracy by promoting transparency and financing political parties and election campaigns. He is also the overall coordinator of African Election Observers Network, AFIONET, which is the apex coordinating platform for election observers in Africa. Karibuni, Henry. It's good to have you.
Thank you very much, Felix and colleagues. Happy to be here, commemorate this International Day of Democracy. Quite an honor for me.
Great. I expect McDonald Wanika to join us from Zimbabwe, but allow me, yes, he's on call. McDonald, he is the regional director for Southern Africa Accountability Lab, a political scientist, an expert in African politics. They have just gone through an election, which until now, we are still debating. McDonald, you're welcome.
Thank you so much, Felix, and it is an honor to be part of the system panel.
Great, pleasure is ours. We expect a lady to be part of this conversation. Allow me to introduce her in her absentia, but when she joins in, I'll be able to throw her in the deep end straight away. She's Miss Priscilla Mlenga Isaac, who is a former electoral officer at the Electoral Commission of Zambia. She served at the Electoral Management Board in Zambia for 17 years, retired in 2017, and she was the first female chief executive of that Electoral Management Body in 2011. But prior serving, she served as the Deputy Director of Elections and Voter Education. She has vast experience in the management of elections and has observed elections under a number of outfits: Commonwealth, African Union, SADC, the Finnish Elections at the Visitors Program, UK Election Visitors Program, including IFES, American Visitors Program. When she joins in, we will be able to have her make a contribution to this conversation. Gentlemen, once again, you're welcome to this very interesting conversation, timely, relevant, where we reflect on the state of democracy under the topic military coups, zombie elections, and the future of democracy in Africa. And your host today is Felix Kafuma. And allow me to kick it off straight away. I'm going to give each one of you a 3-minute reflection on the state of democracy in Africa. Your take, what do you see from where you stand, from where you are at? And let me start with Slim. What do you make of the state of democracy in Africa?
The state of democracy in Africa is in a kind of key milestone, let's say, because we are seeing a lot of coup almost everywhere, particularly in Western Africa, also in North Africa, as Tunisia is also in a way or the other concerned. Is not a military coup, but the democracy is really in danger. So to do not put too much pressure on ourselves as African citizens, we think the democracy is under threat everywhere around the world, since we are living a political but also a huge economic crisis all over the world due to the COVID-19, but not just that, due to the war in Ukraine. So there is a lot of exogenous reason, exogenous factor that led to put in doubt the democracy all over the world. A few years ago, even few decades ago, the democracy was the only and the exclusive way of imagine how to deal with the public affairs in let's say the modern states. However, since few years, we this absolute good, let's say, in term of philosophical way, is really put in doubt, since some other alternative are succeeding in terms of economics insights. So it's not really easy today to fight for democracy, because basically the democracy should deliver. However, in a lot of country, at least in my country, the democracy doesn't deliver it. So people are really frustrated about the democracy, and what we are seeing is a backsliding, a little by little, of what was built since what was called the Tunisian revolution that happened in 2011. But since 2021, let's say, things are going on the wrong way, mainly to the COVID, but also to strictly political reason today. With the democracy is behind us, let's say, and we are fighting today to keep what was built during the last decade in Tunisia. And I hope that sharing lesson throughout all the continent should help Tunisian, but all the African to struggle for the rights, to struggle for a better democracy, and to be to convince the people that the democracy is not something Western luxury or whatever. It's something that we should fight for, and is not never taken for good. So hopefully the path is still long. However, I hope as a Tunisian citizen, but also as an African citizen, that one day all the African countries should be able to live under democracy. This was stated in the African Union Agenda 2063, and hopefully things gonna go in the right way in terms of strengthening the democracy and strengthening the principle of the democracy. And this is exactly what is backsliding today in several countries in Africa. Unfortunately.
Thank you so much, Slim. Indeed, we are following the development in Tunisia. They have suspended. I think now it's ruled by decree. It's be good to know what's happening at that side of the continent. Let me bring in here Samson Itodo, your quick reflections and thoughts on the state of democracy in Africa.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation to speak to this particular issue. Well, let me begin by saying Happy Democracy Day to everyone. And I would start my intervention, in responding to your question about democracy. And I say that, yes, there's something to celebrate about democracy. But if you look at what we shouldn't celebrate about democracy, it appears it's quite high. And so a few weeks ago, we were called by one of Africa's authoritarians and dictators, to make noise. Make noise when he was in captivity or when he was unceremoniously removed from and forcefully removed from office. And I just want to flip that as we reflect about democracy. And I'd say that we need to make noise for Africa's redemption. And as we think about democracy, and as we celebrate democracy, I think we should, make a clarion call and make noise for Africa's redemption. Because if you look across the continent, and this discussion is situated within, the background of the unconstitutional changes of government and military dictatorship across the continent. And so our continent, faces a pandemic of discontent because of the failure, of the state to address, the issues that actually bedevil our society. What we have seen, is a system of government that has consistently failed the people. And a lot of people, especially young people, are questioning, the efficacy of democracy and its potential of addressing the challenges that people face. And so you can see that this is what is accounts for this momentary surge in support for alternative forms of government. So as we celebrate, democracy, I want us to make noise, for the redemption of the continent. And it's actually a redemption from the throes of today's exploitative local elites and their foreign backers. It's actually a redemption from the alienation of youth. Good a thing. The focus of this year's International Day of Democracy is empowering youth. And so we need to redeem our continent from all forms of political and economic exclusion. And so it's really time, for a paradigm shift. And it's one, that places people at the center, at the back, and at the heart of democracy. Only then, can democracy begin to regain, the kind of support that it had in the last 10, 20 years. So those will be my sort of initial reflection on this day of democracy.
Thank you so much, Samson. In fact, you remind me of there's always been that debate where people are now questioning whether democracy has delivered the desired expectations. But thank you for those reflections. Let me now bring in McDonald, your quick reflections.
Thank you so much, Felix, for this opportunity to reflect on what is an important day on the democracy calendar globally, and I think that in terms of my reflections of where we are, where democracy is concerned on the continent, it starts with this: the fact that this day, which we say is an important day on the democracy calendar globally, is fairly muted in terms of conversations that are taking place on the continent. I don't think that they are, reverberating celebrations or noises as Samson is encouraging us to do in support of democracy today on the continent. And that in itself shows you a bit about the state of affairs where democracy is concerned on the continent. I mean, part of the reflections that we are sharing are concerns around what others have characterized as democracy in decline, and in some respects, I think we can be able to characterize what is happening on the continent in terms of that. But my first reflection is also to problematize that. We are lamenting that democracy is in decline, but has democracy really been there in some of these places where we have seen, it going back. When you look at the situation in Gabon with the coups, we can lament the coup in Gabon, but was that state democratic in the first place? When we go to Mali and what has been happening there, again with the military coups, the disputed elections, is it in 2007, 8 or 9 there? To what extent has that country itself actually been democratic? The same can be said about Niger, presided over by military regimes over time, and then we have a first or an initial successful handover of power from one civilian to another. We give the one we have handed over power a prize. I think the latest winner of the Mo Ibrahim prize for good governance is actually the former president of Niger. What happened there was good, but is that in itself enough to qualify a country like Niger as democratic? So we can lament the upsurge in coups, but let us not fool ourselves. What is happening is not necessarily democracy in decline. What we are seeing is a deeper and more dangerous form of authoritarianism in places where authoritarianism was already in place in one form or another. Colleagues from Uganda, I'm sure you're very familiar with the concept of the many faces of authoritarianism. In some places, it takes a military reform. In some places, it takes a nationalist radical form. In other places, it takes the form of competitive authoritarianism. But all these different variations are not democracy. And these are the kinds of variations that we see where regimes are concerned on our continent. So do we aspire for democratization? Definitely. Is democracy itself in decline? I think that's a conversation that we need to have a deeper engagement on. It's clear democratic space is reducing, civic space is reducing, freedoms are reducing, accountability is reducing, but they are reducing from a point where we had not necessarily, I think in a lot of respects, reached the ideal of substantive democratization. In a lot of instances, what we are lamenting is the moving back or the backsliding from electoral democracy of some sort, from electoral authoritarianism and other types of regime, but definitely not democratization. I think we need to start from that honest place if we are serious about building a concerted effort at democratization across the continent. Those would be sort of like my opening remarks, Felix.
Thank you, McDonald. Quite provocative, I might say. Let me bring in here Priscilla. It's good to have you. I did introduce you in your absentia, but finally you are joined us. We found us when we just started. We are just reflecting your quick thoughts on the state of democracy in Africa.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, and for the opportunity to be part of this panel this afternoon. Sorry, I had a bit of challenge to join. I think riding on what my colleagues have already said, I would agree with all of them that indeed we are currently in a space in our continent where seeing real democratization and democracy prevailing across the continent, there is a great need. I think across the continent, there's a lot of disillusionment of what people expect, especially after a change of government. There'll be different expectations. I recall back in 1991 when our first, when UNIP, that was our first ruling party in Zambia, lost the elections to the MMD. The expectation was that the move from a single party state into a multi-party state would ensure that people's rights and freedoms and all that would be really, take the fore, and also they look forward to improvement in the economy of the country and so forth. But you will find that over the years, disillusionment crept in as people wondered whether, the multi-party dispensation in which we were in was a true reflection of a return to, to being a real democratic state. And I think one of the challenges we found from an electoral manager point of view was over the years we saw this, to a certain extent, a fluctuation in voter participation in elections, and what would term as voter fatigue, as when you inquired from the electorate as to why they were reluctant to register as voters or to participate in elections, a lot of the comments we would get back is, what is the point? Even if I vote, what will change? And I think that is the challenge that we have to throw to our leaders, that when they elected into office with a promise to change whatever they see as the need to change and what the masses are calling for, they should keep to their word. But unfortunately, I don't think this is the case currently. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Indeed, we are glad we're gonna benefit from your experience as someone who has been on the other side as the umpire of an election, because that has been one of the issues concerning the role EMBs play in ensuring that at least the only pathway to some form of what we call peaceful transfer or change of government or power, what we call the election, which we've seen in Africa, many of them are being highly questioned. What could be the challenges that you face? So it would be very good benefit from your conversation. But before I come back to you, I don't know whether Henry, are you back on call so that you can also share your quick reflections? Henry, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, Felix, and of course, having listened from my colleagues, I build from the point Samson mentioned about making noise for democracy, and I want to agree with the McDonald that there isn't much we can actually make some noise for in terms of democracy. And the reason being, if you look at what is happening now, the resurgence of military coups, and many of them particularly happening in Francophone Africa, if you look at the story behind the story, you get to see that there's something that cuts across. And what is cutting across is the fact that when France granted independence to its former colonies, it actually never granted them independence. It granted them what you called rightly so fake independence. And because it maintained the power of a military, it enjoyed the leverage to intervene militarily wherever it wanted. And we can tell from the records that until now, France has intervened militarily over 50 times in former French colonies. It maintained the stranglehold over the monetary system, but also, control over the monetary system, but also it maintained former colonies as pure sources of raw materials, including oil, gas, uranium, manganese, and many others. So what we are seeing now is an effort to liberate themselves, the former French colonies that never received the full independence, of where was the African Union and the rest of the brothers from the other Anglophone countries. When we knew that our brothers in Francophone Africa never received the true independence, we kept quiet. But the bigger point to mention there is the fact that the military men that have taken over power in these countries have promised a return to civilian rule. What they have not mentioned is when. But when you look around the continent, every time military leaders have taken over power, they have actually stuck there. They have not gone away. Okay, and we have no shortage of such leaders. We know that the leader who overthrew Guinea's Alpha Conde, Lieutenant Colonel Mamade Doumbouya, is still there. All right. We know that the the leader in Uganda who came through military instruction is still here. The leader in Rwanda is still there. The leader of what is it called? Chad, Idrissa Dabi, who took over power through a coup, is still there. And therefore, we don't know whether really these military men will give us a return to democracy. But that said, you look at those countries where democracy elections have been held, because in Africa we have learned and mastered the art of conducting elections without there being democracy. We've conducted elections for elections' sake, which is why we refer to them now as zombie elections, elections that have been fixed from the start, elections whose outcome is already predetermined, elections that have failed to grant the peoples of Africa peaceful transitions from one regime to the next. And therefore, we are at a state where we actually don't know what to do, because we hear the African Union condemning the takeover, military takeovers, the coups. We hear the regional economic communities condemning, and actually ECOWAS was speaking, in certain terms, and they've been quite strong, come out strong against Niger. And of course, on one hand, they could have a point. But the thing is that these brothers of ours in Francophone Africa have been suffering untold, poverty and plunder of their resources for 60 years. We kept quiet. Why are we? Do we have the locus standi to say anything now? How about countries where regimes have fixed elections, where countries, the leaders in place have tinkered with the constitutions to remove term limits in order to entrench what you can call something akin to life presidency, something akin to what we are seeing in Gabon. We are seeing that after staying so long in power, there is even an effort to make sure that if they are going to transfer power to another leader, it has to be their sons. We see it in Uganda. We see it in Rwanda. We are seeing it in other countries. And so you wonder, therefore, do we really have democracy? Is there anything to celebrate? And if the leaders have betrayed us, if the African Union is not strong enough, is picking and choosing who they come out strong on, we did not see them come out strong on Zimbabwe, because Zimbabwe was a coup in everything but name. So do they have locus standi? And if all of the leaders have betrayed us, we see what is happening in Tunisia. And I'm happy that Selim is here. Where is the African Union when all these abuses are happening? And where does that leave us as the peoples of Africa? So on this International Day of Democracy, I think we need to take introspection, especially us who have been favored to be in these spaces and have these voices, because many of our brothers and sisters are not even able to have these platforms we are having. What is it that we can do, we the citizens that have the mouths, but also can engage in spaces in order to redeem democracy and have Africa come to democracy and realization of democracy? Because we wonder why we cannot have leaders that, like we had at the time in the 1960s, leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, who said the independence of Ghana means nothing. Leaders like Ahmed Ben Bella, who said we should die a little. Who is ready to die a little here to this time around? So you get to see that leaders seem to be more interested in serving selfish interests, and that the public interests are not what is on top of the agendas. So it's a period of introspection. It's a period of thinking through what we can do differently in order to make sure that Africa gets back on the path we call democracy, because it is questionable whether we have ever had anything in a place you can describe and signpost as democracy. Back to you, Felix.
Thank you, Henry. The bigger question that seems to be coming through is, did we ever have democracy? So that we can now talk about or celebrate any form of democracy on this continent called Africa. But let me quickly get into specifics of this conversation. Remember, the topic is military coups, zombie elections. and the future of democracy in Africa. And Slim, I'm going to start with you because Francophone countries, have been in the news in the last couple of years for the very interesting reasons. You talk about military coups. There's even now a term coined that they have called it a belt of coups. I also, Henry touched it a bit. Your president, Kai Said, in 2021, I think, fired the prime minister, suspended the parliament. He's ruling by decree. Help us understand, especially looking at the French, the former French. Interestingly, France had more colonies than even the counterparts, the Brits. What are those historical factors that seem to be contributing to the prevalence of military coups in Africa, specifically the French colonies?
Honestly, I will say the problem of democracy in North Africa, but in particular in Tunisia, today is a 100% Tunisian problem. As in every country, there is like a lot of factors trying to disturb what is happening. However, even as you mentioned, even the assembly was frozen in 2021. Even if the democracy that we tried to build during the last decade backslided completely, and for objective reason. Honestly, when we were working to build the democracy, we forget to focus on some other priority of the people. I mean, today in Tunisia, if you want to remove a tooth, you have to wait 4 months. Today in Tunisia, if you want to have some bread, you have to make the queue for hours. If you want to have a medicine, you have to wait until someone come back from abroad. So I totally understand that for a regular citizen here in Tunisia, the democracy is not a priority. But with a very catastrophic educational system, we can't say to a plain citizen, let's say, who want to just to remove a tooth, that you should consider the democracy and human rights as a priority. It's a priority. However, there is more, let's say, basic priority. I'm not saying the democracy is not a priority or a key element in our lives as a African citizen. However, we should also focus that the democracy by its own will never deliver. And even today, like, the polls show that a large majority, a little bit less than the half of the population, still agree with Qais Said. Because what happened in July 2021 and the dismantlement of the executive, let's say, a lot of people went in the street and were happy. They were enjoying this moment, celebrating this moment. And it was totally understood in Tunisia because during this mandate of the assembly, nothing happened. And people were expecting more to happen. And when we keep waiting, when you have a pandemic, I mean, Tunisia, one of the most country touched by the COVID-19. I don't know exactly the number. However, we have been hugely touched by this COVID-19. So today, if we want to protect the democracy, or at least to promote the democracy, we have to keep in mind that the democracy by its own doesn't feed people, doesn't heal people when they are sick, doesn't let people have a proper and drinkable water when they try to open the water in their own homes. So yes, democracy is a priority. Human rights should be protected, guaranteed. But we can't consider them as the only and unique and exclusive priority in our continent, because it's not easy to express his voice if you are hungry, simply. During the last legislative election in Tunisia, it was really biased, but just a little bit more than 11% of people expressed their voices. So this shows that the democracy, if don't deliver, is not really seen as a priority and as a basic need, which is a basic need basically. But I don't know, if I have to choose between eating and voting, I will of course choose to eat. So we should keep fighting for democracy, but not only for democracy. I mean, for economic and social reforms too. Thank you. Over to you.
Interesting. Why I'm smiling to your submission, because this conversation keeps coming back of whether democracy is the most immediate need in the in especially in Africa, where we have other prevalent challenges of on the Maslow's basic hierarchy of needs. Questions of where do I get my next meal? And we've had this conversation back and forth. And this brings me to a question which I hadn't even prepared, but I'm going to ask it anyway. And I'm going to ask Itodo on this one. Could it be possible, Itodo, because as you discuss the historical challenges of Africa, you know, there was a way when we embraced democracy, independence, but we've seen ourselves getting back into a state where the military, even where we have democracy, it's the military behind democracy or democratic reforms, quote unquote. Can I ask a question directly to you? Is it time that we redefine the democracy we need that works for Africa? Is the template we were handed over not necessarily the best fit for Africa? Itodo, your take.
Well, I don't want to get into ideological binaries about whether there's a Western style democracy or there's an African style democracy, um, or the kind of democracy that was handed down to us. Because what we were told is that, you know, democracy is about compliance with rules. And the kind of democracy Africans actually desire, it's not a democracy, it's a democracy that goes beyond compliance with rules, but the one that delivers outcomes. Because all this conversation, like was mentioned by previous speakers, it's about the instrumental outcomes of democracy. People want improved livelihoods, people want security, because they expect that the state will take that responsibility. The second bit deals with freedom, and that the whole concept of a state, you know, it's liberty, you know, freedom, and also a bit of cohesion, because state has monopoly, you know, of violence, so it's able to curtail human excesses to create a level playing field for all. But I think there's the kind of democracy that Africans actually desire, and it's not just peculiar to Africa. This debate, you know, it's everywhere in the world. So it's the one, you know, where people are free. By freedom, I mean that journalists are not prime targets of the state, like we see in South Africa, in Nigeria, you know, even in Uganda. That the democracy is just simple. What is just democracy? Is how do we administer, you know, state affairs in a way that it makes everybody better off and not worse off. And so, if democracy continues to concentrate power on a few, and this again brings us to the point where we talk about, you know, this discussion around military coups. The kind of democracy that Africans desire is one where there is decentralization of power, and also you need to decondense power. Because the more you continue to concentrate power on a particular elite, and that's why we constantly make the point that the kind of noise that we need to make for democracy is a noise of redemption from exploitative local elites. And a few weeks ago, one of those exploitative local elites, was the one who was making the call, to make a noise. And these are the kinds of people, from Uganda to Cameroon to Niger to Gabon, the voices from the streets are uniform. And it's simply, we need a redemption from people who have held political power for too long as though it's their personal or private estate. That is not the kind of democracy. Outcomes for democracy. The third, and my last comment on this, it's about institutions. You can't have democracy without institutions. And there are several institutions within a democratic setting. You have institutions of accountability, or what you call agencies of protection. If powers are distributed between the parliament, the executive, and the judiciary, the ability of each arm of government to keep the other in check actually matters. But where you have the situation where powers are not distributed evenly and one arm of government decides to encroach, on the powers and the rights of the other, or what you currently have within our continent, where you have a capture of judicial institutions, making them so disempowered that they cannot deliver justice. These are some of the big issues. So for me, it's not to engage in the ideology.
Did I lose Samson?
It looks like.
Yeah, I think I lost Samson. He was making a very interesting uh, um, submission, and which I want to pick from. I don't know whether Priscilla is on call. Priscilla, on call because Samson triggers the question that I think I need to play the ball in your court. Okay, I don't also have Priscilla, so let me bring you in here, Henry. Henry, you have coined the word zombie elections, and uh, first of all, what are zombie elections for someone who is just interfacing with this word for the first time? And as you answer what are zombie elections, just show us how these zombie elections actually are hindering genuine democratic progression in Africa.
Thank you very much, Felix. But before I go to your question proper, allow me to build on where Samson left it, because he tried to answer to rebuttal the view that Slim put forward. The fact that the people of Tunisia did not need that parliament, which is why even if it remains dissolved, nobody misses it. I think the point of the matter is that it's not true that people do not need the parliament, but it's the personalities, the elites in that house we have now that have captured the power and have tended to use it to satisfy only their personal interests. But the truth of the matter is, democracy in Africa needs also representation. If we are going to have institutions strengthened, we need them, occupied by individuals that are meaning well, individuals that are patriotic, and individuals that are ready and willing to serve the public interest. But that said, to your question about zombie elections, actually, I did not call, it was not, I'm not the one who originated it, but it seems to be an agreement within the fraternity of democracy practitioners that zombie elections are those elections that are fixed from the start. It's actually something you can call the living dead of elections. You can only recognize it in form, but in terms of substance, there's nothing. They're completely devoid of any substance. So elections are conducted in circumstances where political parties and other opposition leaders are not allowed to canvass for elections. The outcome of those elections is clear. The counting and the tabulation and the transmission of results is questionable. The electoral management bodies don't act in a manner that they are impartial. They seem to be responding only and acting in the interests of the incumbent, and that they seem to be as if their only ultimate goal is to ensure that incumbency remains in place and that that happens with some level of legitimacy. So when elections are like this, when you have a situation where the citizens themselves who are trying to participate in the electoral processes as observers being arrested and charged with the trumped up, accusations such as engaging in treasonous acts, I think you get to see that there is no intention to be democratic. Now, so such elections that you can tell from the start what the outcome will be are only zombie elections. But it's not does not only stop on elections. We also have what we call zombie democracy in Africa, democracy that does not exist. We have read the reports of Freedom House that indicates that more than half of the countries as we speak today in Africa are classified as autocrats, autocracy. And so these are some of the things that we are having now. How is this impacting on democracy? Is that we are seeing a decline in the number of citizens turning out to vote. So the fact that the voter turnout is declining means that less and less people are interested in participating in these elections. And if elections then become a game of the few, then they seem to have to make sense. Now, the other thing is that the electors fail then to be able to exercise electoral accountability, because you find that there is no way the electors can vote out the leaders that are not serving them. Those members of parliament, we have them in my own country, just as Sirim said. You look at a group of members of parliament serving personal interests and only being there to do as they are told by the executive. In short, they are captured. I have always joked when I'm interacting with the members of parliament that I don't see myself ever contesting for a parliamentary seat, because the only thing I think is good enough for that parliament is to blow it up so that you have fresh new faces in that house. So we need the institution called parliament that is functional. We need people having power and being able to exercise it to pick, to choose the best leaders that should govern them, and that they should be able to remove those leaders that are not serving them. A situation where it is literally and technically impossible to vote out the leader, a situation where you go into an election. I mean, we went into an election in Zimbabwe knowing that hook or crook, it's Mnangagwa that must be, declared leader. We go into an election in Uganda knowing hook or crook, it will be Yoweri Museveni, as long as he's on the ballot paper, that wins. We know in Rwanda, for as long as Paul Kagame has participated, he's the one to be on the declared winner. We know in Cameroon, for as long as Paul Biya is on the ballot paper, he will be the one declared winner. We knew in Gabon that for as long as Ali Bong is on the ballot paper, he will be the only one declared winner. We knew these things. So elections that are fixed from the start are really living dead of elections, and they're not serving the interests of an ordinary African. So which is why we call them zombie elections. Back to you, Felix.
Thank you, Henry. I don't know whether Priscilla is back on call, because I have questions around the electoral management bodies, and especially when you talk about elections. Yes, Priscilla, you're there. Thank you.
Yes, I am.
Yeah, from your practical experience, you've been in that seat before, where you oversee an election. And of late, there have been a lot of debates around in the manner in which most electoral management bodies conduct and how far they contribute to the sanity of electoral democracy in Africa. And my question to you is one, a little bit blunt, but I'll ask anyway, is that why are electoral management bodies across Africa, in most cases where elections and electoral outcomes are contested, why are they, many of them, considered to be accomplice to the electoral challenges, especially as umpires? What are those challenges that electoral management bodies face to ensure that they balance being autonomous to deliver free and fair elections, but also to contribute to this concept of democracy in Africa?
Okay, thank you for that, Felix. I think The biggest challenge that a lot of electoral management bodies face across the continent. And
Speak through the
I'll give
microphone
our
so that you can be audible.
okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Sorry, I had issues connecting using the laptop, so I'm using the phone. But just signal me when I'm not clear. Yeah. So I was saying that you see, basically, elections are based on the law. It's a question of the rule of law being abided by in the conduct of election. And that is the first thing that an electoral management body needs to take into consideration in doing their work. That their work as an electoral management body is about doing their work in accordance with the law, within the mandate that they've been given by the law. And the challenges that are faced, as we discussed, is that the people that we are put to manage, to guide in these whole processes, more often than not, will be the first ones not to abide by the law, be they the ruling party, the opposition, and maybe other stakeholders. In fact, you find the ones that are most obedient in abiding by the law are the voters. Tell the voters, registration of voters is now, you need this and this to go and register. They will go, take what they need, queue up, and do what needs to be done. The election day, voters stand in a queue, wait for your turn to vote. They will do that and so forth. But when it comes to the contestants, that's where you find the challenge. And in some cases, you may find that the EMB may be put under pressure by the government in power, the party in power. And unless you have a fearless EMB that can stand up to the different pressures, be it from the ruling party or the opposition or civil society, that's where now you find that there is doubt in the independence of an EMB. So for us, especially during my tenure, we always used to remind the executive and the ruling party that the onus was on them to abide by the rules of the game if they expected the other players in the elections to do so. Because once the executive does not give that support in ensuring that the ruling party go by the rules and so forth, it makes the work of the electoral commission very difficult. And you find that in carpeting the ruling party to say that you're not going by the rules and so forth, immediately you'll be branded to be in league with the opposition. And if you don't carpet the ruling party when they break the rules, immediately the opposition will say you are in bed with the ruling party. So really, it's a big challenge for an EMP. And like I said earlier on, an EMP just needs to have not just the independence that is written in the legislation which they abide by, but to have that fearless independence where they are able to call a spade a spade. And also, what is needed is that the electoral legislation should be enabling for the EMP to be able to manage independently, to be able to exercise its powers in, in the administration of elections. Because if it doesn't have that all-encompassing powers and legislation to be able to manage independently, to be able to exercise its powers to keep things in control, then it makes their work very, very, very difficult.
Thank you so much, Priscilla, for sharing your experiences. McDonald, I don't know whether they're on call because I want to pick it up from. Um, yes, you're there. We all saw that clip where one of the deposed presidents was calling for help, for international help, um, and this now ties in my question around the role of international actors in buffeting and protecting um, countries, especially protecting countries where democracy seems to be under attack. In most cases, where coups um, are becoming the order of the day. What role can they play? Is there a role they can play? And if it's what role can they play in trying to protect that space that we're all talking about now, the democratic space?
Yeah, no, thanks a lot for that question, Felix. I think it's interesting because I think the point that we were trying to make at the start of the conversation was that countries like Gabon and the regime that your friend was presiding over before calling for all of us to make noise, make noise, make noise, was in itself not a democratic dispensation or a democratic regime, so to speak. And I think in situations like that, it's a very tough situation because we need to be able to stand on principle, right? I think that if we are able to base our actions and encourage international actors to act on the basis of principle and act on the basis of values, then chances are we should not have found ourselves in a situation where someone, would be presiding over the state on account of a flawed election. The election that took place in Gabon a couple of weeks ago was roundly condemned by everyone, and even before the declaration. But it was not the first time for that to happen. It had happened before. In fact, that family had been presiding over the country for almost 50 years and doing so in fashions that were undemocratic in themselves. The first responsibility of the people and the international community was supposed not to have tolerated that kind of arrangement. So that is what we need to do. If we want to avoid situations or dilemmas where a regime is deposed through unconstitutional means, if we want to have the local standard to act and respond to those kinds of situations, we need to start by acting against autocrats who steal elections in the first place, before we start talking about what happens in the event of a coup. Because as I said, some of these regimes were not there by virtue of popular, democratic, and legitimate means in the first place. So I want to join Samson. I want to join other colleagues on this call and say, we really do have our work cut out on the continent where democracy is concerned, right? And we need to begin the process of pushing and lobbying for adherence to principles and values, the building of strong institutions, and screaming bloody murder every time there is an unaccountable infraction, every time that freedoms are taken away from people. Because that is the only way that we can then be able to say when a regime is deposed militarily, yet it is popular and it is legitimate, we can then stand up and shout from the tops of the roof that no, this is not good, it should not happen, because that regime will be legitimate in the first place. The situations that are confronting us at the moment, in the main, the regimes themselves are undemocratic and illegitimate, except perhaps for the Niger case. I think that would be one of the exceptions in terms of what has been happening on the continent. So it's a tough question, but it begins and ends with values. It begins and ends with building trust in our institutions and standing on those. I really liked the input by Priscilla. Because Zambia does give us a very good example of what happens. Myself and a colleague once did a paper called "As Went the Institutions, So Went the Transition." And Zambia shows us that if institutions remain professional, if they are fiercely independent, and do not brook interference from the executive, even the democratization will follow that particular path. But if they allow themselves to be captured, if they are wish-wash in terms of their independence and exercising their legitimate rights and powers, then that also is the way that the transition will go. So we really need to start the principles, values, and building strong institutions. I think if we do that, we will set ourselves on a decent trajectory in terms of the future of democratization on the continent.
Thank you so much, McDonald. Slim, are you there? Because this now throws me into another question. Yes, Slim, you there? I don't know. I'm sure you. When I was reading your profile, you are an electoral. You observe elections, so you're a citizen election observer. But if
Yes.
you've been also following trends, I think in Sierra Leone, citizen election observers were harassed by the incumbent regime that was contesting that election. Come to Zimbabwe, there were arrests made. Back in Uganda, there were arrests made on the citizen election observers. It seems to be a common trend or trajectory that when citizen election observers, by law and by mandate, interest themselves and participate in electoral processes, um, they tend to find themselves crossing the wrong path with, in most cases, the incumbent regimes. And my question to that regard is one is how do we protect that space? How do we protect citizen election observers? How do we ensure that they continue to perform their role and mandate without the interference of states, especially of incumbent regimes that are also part of those that are competing in an election? How do we even promote citizen election observation as a concept and as a practice?
Honestly, I think, as you confirmed, Felix, it's a trend today in Africa across all over the continent that the civic observation of every election is under the threat. Nevertheless, we should highlight that what is happening wrong today during every electoral cycle is not during the election day. So what we should consider as an observer, as a citizen observing, is that we should focus more on what is happening before the election day, because we kept too much focus on the election day while what was happening in a wrong way was happening before the election day. So what we need to do as a civic observer is to rethink about our methodology, to rethink about what we are observing and how we should observe it, because we were too much focusing on the election day observation, which needs a lot of observer, while what is happening wrong, for example, on the amendment of the electoral laws, or on the public funding of campaigns, is more dangerous for the democratic principle of every election than the election day, because a lot of happening in under some regime that are aware that all the eyes will be on them during the election day. All the law maneuver, let's say, are happening before the election date. And as an observer, as a citizen observer, we should take care more about the different steps of the cycle, the different phases of the electoral cycle, a part of the election day, which will need less people, and so we will be less harassed and less under the threat, as you mentioned first. So we need to rethink about our approach when we are observing, and keep an eye on the all the cycle, in fact, not just the election day, but keep an eye on the cycle itself, even starting from the amendment or the revision of the electoral code, and then I mean, the election day is not the big deal today when we are not in a full democracies, let's say.
Thank you so much. Samson, I'm bringing you in here, and feel free to make a rejoinder on that one as well. But also, my question is in line, and I'm starting to move forward on how do we move. We've talked about the challenges of democracy in Africa, but how do we move from here? How do we get to a point that we can talk about uh, democracy in a manner that we even see the dividends of democracy across Africa? Do we even have successful models in Africa, countries we can look at and say, okay, I think because it's very good to benchmark but also learn from others that we think these ones are doing better. At one point, there was a time when Ghana was the envy of democratic reforms in Africa, but also as time has gone by, we've seen a bit of reversals. Are there countries we can really look up to in Africa here, but also globally? But also, how do we move out of this?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Well, I think this question that you asked is one that everyone seems to be pondering on where do we go from here? And this is where what I would say, that first we need to expand the political space in such a way that we don't limit political participation or political competition to the traditional political institutions that we have, because these traditional political institutions, to a large extent, seem to have failed, or to be magnanimous, are failing. One of them is our political parties. This idea that within the continent, liberation parties project themselves as the saviors of the people, and therefore people should not question their programs. People have no right to vote them out of office. I think it's a mentality that needs to change. And so my sense is we've got to fix, these political institutions, because somewhat they have lost their vitality, or again, they are losing their vitality, and break away from this notion that political participation and contest needs to be within these institutions. And that requires a kind of Pan-African reawakening and a political consciousness and education. We need to invest in political education. And it's one where we don't limit democracy to just elections. That yes, elections are part of democracy, they're a pillar of democracy, but then the work of governance actually begins after elections, or the work of democracy begins after elections. That you can have credible elections, you can have clean elections, but there are no guarantee that you have accountable and transparent leaders, because good elections do not in themselves guarantee what? Good governance. Therefore, you need an active citizenry that holds leaders to account to campaign promises. So you can see citizens' initiatives like monitoring campaign promises, or several barometers or promise meters that you see across the continent. But issues around budgets and how citizens are engaging with budgets, how they are engaging public procurements, how they are engaging, how decisions are being made both in parliament, I think it's critical for where we go from here. So you need that level of political consciousness. I think the third thing, it's we need to expand the bounds of accountability. Within the democratic setting, you've got the option of recall, you've got the option of impeachment. I think that we need to expand, the bounds of accountability, that we don't need to wait for 4 years or 5 years before we fire political leaders who are not performing. We don't need elections. We don't need to wait for another round of elections. That if after a period of time, no matter how short, that political leaders are engaged in certain bad behavior that undermines democracy, there has to be a way of holding those leaders to account. And I see the people actually playing a critical role. So how the form and the texture of how this will operate, I probably don't have the solution, but this is something I'm thinking about. I am not thinking about any extra constitutional means, but I'll just say this in conclusion, that the right for rebellion is a right that is guaranteed even within the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so when citizens rebel, I think that we should recognize that they have a right, to do or to push against dictatorial tendencies of our political leaders. Because what do you expect from citizens when institutions are so decimated and disempowered that they cannot hold, these authoritarians to account? They are left with no option. And this is why they are looking for alternatives. And our regional institutions like the Africa Union, like ECOWAS, like IGAD, like ECAS, like SADC, they've got to rise to the occasion to ensure that they take preventive measures. And it's not when, their colleagues who steal elections, oppress the people, are moved or ejected forcefully out of office that they become reactionary. Because the legitimacy of these regional institutions that should be the custodian, of our norms and standards have been questioned over the years. And so I think the point I'm making here is that we all have a collective responsibility to protect democracy, and that there is no other form of government that can deliver, what democracy can deliver. Even if you have dictatorships delivering economic development, I want us to know that it is short-lived, it is ephemeral in every respect, that you can only get sustainable or guaranteed sort of progress that is collective in nature, but also guarantees freedom and public participation only in a democratic system of government. Over.
Thank you so much. And Henry, I wanted to build on that one as well, as you answer the question on where do we go from here, but also in there, just to pick one of the submissions Itodo made around redemption, making that clarion call, redemption from the exploitative local elites. How do we improve the quality of our politics, which now has been hijacked by the exploitative local elites? But also, how do we shake off the hangover of colonialism? Because we cannot discuss democracy without looking at where we are coming from. How do we shake it off, that hangover of colonialism that seems to until now affect the quality of our elections? But as we come to conclusion, your thoughts?
Thank you very much, Felix. Samson Itodo raises very pertinent issues here when he talks about political parties, and on that very point of exploitative elites that seem to be capturing the power from the citizens and engaging in businesses that are quite selfish in nature, because many of them are driven by selfish interests, and they serve, they put self before public. Now, you get to see that one of the factors that have ensured that these elites stay put in the positions they are in to exploit but also mislead us are the political parties themselves, because they have captured these political parties and carved them into exclusive spaces of the elite, and first of all the economic elite, because if you don't have money you don't get to be nominated to go through that political party. So they have formed a club. So one thing I can agree with Samson is that these political parties have let us down. And hey, who said that democracy can only survive with the political parties? Because I know the way it is understood in the global north is that the political parties are the vehicles upon which democracy moves. But I remember Mwalimu Julius Nyerere one time asked a question that what is the difference between choosing between political parties and choosing between individuals? Because the thing is that whether it is political parties or individuals, there is competition on which people cast their ballots. And if you listen closely to the arguments that are being advanced in South Africa, where they were arguing for the reinstatement, introduction, amendment of the law to allow individual candidates, they were saying that these candidates that are proposed by political parties on the political party lists, they end up not serving the interests of the electors. They are serving interests of the political party leaders. Now, in countries such as Madagascar, such as Mauritius, and many others where political parties have the discretion to even appoint, because those restrictions allow them the liberty of not going through the normal party primaries, but they can handpick. A political party leader handpicks, and when they handpick, they are handpicking club members. These are the elites that have captured Africa and have placed democracy on the back foot, and they have tended to serve the interests of Westerners. We've seen that in Francophone Africa. It's prevalent in Francophone, in Anglophone Africa. And I also want to agree with Samson that even when the autocracies in Africa are claiming that there are more economic developments within autocracies, and that Africans need more economic development than democracy, these developments are ephemeral. They are so short-lived. We need to understand that the only way forward is democracy. But the thing is that who then can we entrust with this? Because like I said at the start, the African Union has let us down, as so has the regional economic communities, ECOWAS, ECAS, ESC, SADC, and many others. The reason being that these communities are funded by foreigners. So European Union is funded by African Union is funded by European Union. The member states of Africa cannot contribute monies to fund African Union. So if you are funded by European Union, whose interests are you serving? And if France is a member of European Union and they are funding you, and the interest of France is to continue their stronghold, continue maintaining former French colonies as colonies, what do you expect? These regional communities are accessing money from African Union, from European Union, from USAID. How can you be independent? And even when they go to Russia or China, even those are all trappings of captivity. Because whether they are Russians, whether they are Westerners, there are capitalistic interests at play. Russia, is about those socialism, communism, as my elder in Zambia once said, those isms are about to control society. But society has to be free. We need the freedom. African peoples want freedom. The Ubuntu principle is that humanity has to be free to interact, free to help each other, free to make decisions, and therefore that happens. So the hangover you talk about, Felix, wanted me to comment about, is because of the structure we have in place, a structure where you have elites that have been kept in a club that has been maintained and sustained by those structures called political parties that are easily captured by economic interests. They're serving selfish interests and are easily sold to the West. Now, if you have regional economic communities that cannot call out each other, you have an African Union that keeps quiet when Ouattara in Ivory Coast amends the constitution to remove term limits. I was reading the president of Comoros. They are now saying his son is the potential successor. So they are turning African countries into dynasties. And they're doing nothing. You will soon hear Mnangagwa's son is the one being paraded. But you see, why is this happening? And so they have let us down. So it takes us back to what do we do? You ask the question. I think we go back to the citizenry. We need to rise up. We need to educate our citizens, mobilize, and hey, because we are facing an onslaught from those democratic, authoritarian, autocratic, non-democratic, authoritarian, autocratic regimes, the targeting of citizen observers, the targeting of civil society members that are working on democracy, elections, and governance, are intended to have a chilling effect on our work, and discouraging the recruitment of other generations behind us. I think we need to be resilient and stand up tall and be able to speak truth to power, but also not allow to be intimidated. What has not killed us should make us stronger as citizens, because at the end of the day, the world might rest on what we do as citizens to redeem ourselves. That redemption, we need to make noises for ourselves, because hey, from what you had Ali Bong doing, they understand making noise works. Because if he did not know making noise works, he wouldn't be calling for noise, which is why they are silencing us. The autocrats of Africa are silencing us. They don't want us to make noise. Hey, we need to continue making noise, hanging in there, and speaking truth to power, and making sure that we call out those things that we think are having a chilling effect on the democratic progression of Africa. But going forward, we need democracy in Africa. The alternative is not good. We don't want to have autocracy, because autocracy means they can be easily targeted. Countries where you have leaders serving for a long time are the very countries that are being targeted by autocracy, by China, by Russia, because they can be easily bought, but it can be confusing to autocracy if you are changing leaders. Africa needs to rethink, but we need citizenry and citizenship. We need to mobilize the citizens of Africa to act like citizens and live up to the obligations and duties of a citizen. Back to you, Felix.
Thank you so much, Henry. Priscilla, let me come to you as we are winding up. Hope you're on call. Yes, you're on call. I just want to pick your thoughts as we bring this to a close. How can EMBs across Africa, because they have been the center of concern, how can we ensure that EMBs across Africa, how do they restore confidence among the electorate to believe in the process, and also safeguard the process, because elections is the only vehicle as we have now to ensure sustainable democracy. Unmute.
Okay. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, please proceed.
Yeah. Yes. Thanks, Felix. Unfortunately, it's not something that the EMBs can do on their own. It's a collective responsibility. As EMBs, what EMBs can do is to educate the voters on their rights and the importance of them participating in elections, not to be defeated by voter fatigue. Because if there's no participation in elections, then you cannot always guarantee the change that you want. In Zambia, we saw that when the citizenry had decided that they wanted change, whenever they've decided that they wanted change, we've been able to do it through elections. But the onus is also on the political parties, and unfortunately, like has been said, the way political parties across Africa have come across, even in my own country, has been very disappointing. They came through with the liberation spirit to liberate our countries. They did that, and with that, there was a hope that now would have a spirit of commitment and service to the people, to ensure that they enjoyed the acquired freedoms they had gotten through independence, economic freedom, social freedom, and so forth. But this has not been the case. And this is what brings about the disillusionment amongst the electorate. And not only that, there's this need that the political parties need to have that spirit of service, and when in power, they should not be afraid of change, especially if they failed to live up to the expectations of the masses. And in case of opposition parties, there needs to be a unison, a unity of purpose, because what we found in Zambia in past years is that you find that you have so many political parties in opposition, they don't get together, there's no unison, there's no unity of purpose, each one wants to get to State House, and when they don't get there, it's a big issue and so forth. So for me, um, our politicians across the continent must have this spirit of service above self, that they are there to serve the people that have elected them into power. And when the time comes for change, they should not be afraid of that change. Former President Jonathan Goodluck said to me when he observed one of our elections, I think it was 2015, he said to me, he says, you know, you're in a very difficult job, but speaking from experience, to lose an election is a very hard thing. But one has to be magnanimous to accept. And as an EMB, you have to have that fearlessness in you to ensure that the process is managed to the satisfaction of the stakeholders, that they have the confidence that an election was well managed, it was credible and acceptable, irrespective of who wins or loses. But for me, I think as of now, I feel very disheartened when I look at the lack of spirit of service. It's like now people come into office to amass wealth, and that is all they're interested in. And then when people make noise that they are not satisfied with them, it becomes an issue they want to suppress. They don't want to ensure that the elections are well conducted so that the electoral commission gets blamed and so forth. So it's I would say it's a collective effort that is needed as we move forward. And those upcoming young leaders need to know that they need to get to the grassroots. They need to reach the grassroots, because that's where the majority of voters are. In Zambia, we have seen that you find that when now the votes start to come in from the rural areas, the tables start to turn and people start opening their eyes, thinking that the majority of voters were the ones that they were wooing on social media and so forth. No, the masses, the majority for us in Zambia, the majority of the voters are in the rural areas. And when you look back, it took years to change the mindset of the voters in the rural areas from UNIP to MMD, from MMD to PF. And in the last election, UPND. So it's a collective effort, and my prayer is that our leaders will have a heart for the people. And I'm not just talking. I'm not speaking of Zambia. I'm speaking continental wide, to have a heart for the people, because even now we are seeing it in our president now, who is calling for more accountability from leaders in terms of service, serving the people as opposed to amassing wealth. So my prayer is that our leaders across the continent will relook at themselves in terms of service above self, because definitely military coups are not the way to go.
Thank you so much. Indeed, picking it up from where you've left it, McDonald, as we bring this to a close, I've just been looking at the statistics just to confirm. Africa is the youngest, has the youngest population with a median age of 25. So we talk about young people participating, young people defending democracy, young people embracing. I think, and even the theme for this year's International Day of Democracy, we cannot live without talking about the young people. And my question to you, McDonald, are you there? Just to be sure. If I should, oh, great. Yeah. So, how do we now mobilize, galvanize the young people to take up this space uh, um, and be active citizens to promote democracy, defend democracy, but even participate in democratic spaces?
Well, thanks a lot, Felix. I think that it's a very it's 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 a very difficult question. It doesn't lend itself to easy answers. But I'm glad that I'm part of a panel of people who have done it before. If we are talking about mobilizing young people and getting them to be actively engaged in politics, the person who wrote the book on that in Africa is Samson Itoro, with Not Too Young to Run. So it has been done before, it can be done. But I think that the important thing that we need to embrace and acknowledge is that there are no shortcuts to democratization. This idea, I always tell my son that I want does not always get. So simply because we want it, it doesn't necessarily mean it will happen. We need to make the requisite investments in process, especially process around organizing, meaningful organization on the ground. Part of the challenge with political parties and civil society actors in Zimbabwe, in Africa, in Africa, is that we believe in the art of mobilization. Mobilization is about momentary engagement with citizens around a particular issue that has flared up. It's momentary, but it's not sustainable. It's similar to what was being engaged on earlier about development that is fostered in undemocratic settings. It doesn't last. What we need is meaningful organization on the ground that is based on the tradition of organizing, building person by person, building relationships of trust that allow us to be able to act decisively if we need to, because we trust each other on the ground. But in a lot of instances, we are impatient to engage in that kind of work. But for as long as we do not do it, we'll continue to be stuck in this situation. Circumstances alone will not lead to change. Circumstances married by meaningful organization on the ground, skillful organization on the ground, and a legitimate concern and interest in saving people on the ground is what is going to carry us forward. And I think every advocate for democratization on the continent needs to be able to embrace that particular charge, because that is the only way in which we're going to be able to move forward. Anything else, I think we'll be wasting our time and running on spot, so to speak. Those would be my parting reflections, Felix.
Thank you so much, McDonald. I'm gonna give each one of you just 1 minute to wrap it up. Let me start with you, Slim. 1 minute to wrap it up.
Thank you for this very rich exchange. Very insightful idea, by the way. I mean, I wrote a lot of things, but one of the main takeaway is that good election doesn't mean good institution. We need good institution, as said by Mrs. Isaac. We need functional parliament. It's not because we had a parliamentary election that we could have a functional parliament, as said by Henry. And we need to think about our way of involving citizen, as said by Mr. McDonald and Samson. So I think what is happening here around the table show us a lot. We are more concerned as a citizen than maybe people who are in charge of dealing with citizen affairs. So yeah, I hope that this kind of exchange will keep going. And that's all. Thank you very much for the invitation. It was a pleasure to be amongst you.
Thank you so much, Slim. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to have you as well. Samson, if you're there, wrapping it up, your takeaways as well. I think Samson, are you there? Probably we dropped off the call. Okay, probably Samson dropped off the call. All right. Henry, let's wrap it up, your takeaway. 1 minute.
Absolutely. So mine is to make a clarion call to the leaders that are heading institutions of democracy in Africa, that we are calling upon you to demonstrate that you can be the good men and women that can say no to unacceptable demands, directions, and behaviors from autocratic leaders, because it is you to make those institutions work. And if you don't, history would judge you harshly, and your legacy should also start to matter. We want men and women heading those institutions to be big on legacy. We don't want big men and women occupying big institutions of democracy, but who are very small on legacy. So we are calling upon them to stand tall and say no to unacceptable behavior from autocratic leaders. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. I don't know. I still have Priscilla for your takeaway as we wrap it up. If you're there, probably Priscilla also left. McDonald also was able to make his parting shots, and this brings us to a close to a very interesting topic: military coups, zombie elections, and the future of democracy. We can continue this conversation on our social media platforms on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. It's ACFIM Africa. Being yours truly, Felix Kafuma, part of this conversation. Till next time, bye bye. Africa will unite.